I think our thesis is still for a relatively strong global recovery and relatively accommodative policies by global central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve. So I think the backdrop still argues for a mild depreciation of the dollar. I think that trend remains intact for us. And that's still, from a macro perspective, a very helpful backdrop for emerging markets assets. So we don't feel like the phase coming to an end. We still think that there's room to run for emerging markets, particularly as some of the markets have been quite beaten down last year. That has some of our recently more favored cyclical exposures, like consumers and industries. These markets we think will continue to do well. And don't forget that a lot of emerging markets today also have those sectors and companies that are very tied to the megatrends. So we call them the megatrends. So for example, the 5G, the coming of the 5G age, the applications for consumers and industries, as well as a sustainability theme. So I think that these are still supportive of the emerging market thesis.
The problem is that in the past, sometimes we've had great expectations of outperformance from the emerging markets, and it hasn't always delivered. So what makes you so sure this time?
I think that if you look at the balance of risk for global growth, for example, what we're seeing at the moment is that global governments and central banks are still looking at more rather than less stimulus. So I think that's one supportive factor. The other factor is that the overall performance of emerging markets have been quite negative over the last couple of years. But we have seen, as I mentioned earlier, the emergence of technology being a bigger driver of emerging market companies and earnings. And some of the themes are, I think, very tied to, of course, 5G, sustainability, to consumption upgrading. So I think from a fundamental perspective, that's another thing that's changed for emerging markets. So we definitely feel from a cyclical and from a structural perspective, this should still be a relatively good year for emerging market assets.